Welcome to Timeless Detective, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today I bring you a delightful new mystery, featuring the ever-observant and wonderfully sharp Miss Marple, the beloved amateur sleuth, created by Agatha Christie. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel this charming puzzle together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Let's get started. It was a warm and mellow afternoon in St. Mary Mead, the kind that made even the most industrious soul slow their steps. Miss Marple, comfortably seated in her rose garden, sipped her tea and surveyed the late blooms with quiet satisfaction. The bees droned lazily in the lavender, and the air was laced with the faint perfume of autumn. She had just finished reading the parish newsletter, and was reflecting, with gentle amusement, on Mrs. Featherstone's vigorous campaign to have the church bell retuned. "A trifle sharp on the ear, my dear," as she had put it, when a thought passed through her mind, as light and fleeting as the breeze. How pleasant it was when things remained just as they ought. But Miss Marple, with her years of discreet observation and needlepoint insight into human nature, also knew that beneath the smoothest surface there was often something else, entirely. And though she was content in her garden that afternoon, the stillness, she felt, was never permanent. The next morning, as the vicar's boy delivered the post with a grin and a thud of muddy boots, Miss Marple found amongst the usual missives a letter addressed in a spidery, uncertain hand. Her eyes narrowed in recognition. Beatrice Langford. They had known each other since the days of charity committees and Women's Institute debates on jam-making versus marmalade. Beatrice had always been dramatic by nature, but intelligent and well-meaning. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then once more for good measure. "My dear Jane, I know how this must sound, and perhaps you'll think me silly, but there is something in this house, something old and very wrong. It centers around a teapot, of all things. A teapot I should never have kept. There have been strange accidents, and now I fear there may be worse to come. Would you come to Elderflower Lodge, just for a few days? I do not quite trust those around me. Yours in some distress, Beatrice." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. There was a faint tea stain on the corner. "A teapot," she mused. "What a curious thing to fear." By the following afternoon, Miss Marple was winding through the quiet lanes of Chipping Cleghorn in a hired motor car, glancing at the pale countryside half hidden by drifting fog. The trees stood stark against the dull sky, their branches etched like black lace. Elderflower Lodge appeared at last, a large ivy-clad estate that had seen better days. The driver dropped her at the front entrance, and Miss Marple was greeted not by Beatrice, but by a housemaid with red-rimmed eyes and a tremor in her voice. "Mrs. Langford is resting," the girl said, opening the door to a dimly lit hall. "She's been most upset these days." Miss Marple, umbrella in hand, stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of lavender polish and old books. There was a heaviness in the air, a hush, as though the walls themselves were listening. She was shown to a modest guest room and left alone. As she unpacked her overnight case, Miss Marple noticed the corridor outside her room was unnaturally quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful but watched. She thought again of Beatrice's letter and the peculiar fear it had conveyed. A teapot. What could be so dreadful about that? Later that evening, Beatrice emerged from her room for supper, pale and drawn but still possessing her old elegance. She took Miss Marple's hand and whispered, "Thank you, Jane. I feel safer already." Dinner was served in a long wood-panelled room that had seen decades of family gatherings and polite tensions. Around the table sat the rest of the household. Nigel Langford, Beatrice's nephew, was a man of smart tailoring and nervous fingers. His wife Clara was a wisp of a woman, barely touching her food and avoiding everyone's eyes. Dr. Felix Morley, Beatrice's personal physician, had the sort of confident charm that seemed slightly rehearsed. And then there was Charles Merton, a local historian and collector who eyed the antiques in the room more than the people. Polite conversation flitted around the table, but underneath it, something taut lingered. Miss Marple said little but listened a great deal, watching the way Nigel flinched at Beatrice's voice, the way Clara dropped her fork at the mention of the old cabinet, and how Dr. Morley smiled too quickly at nothing at all. They were all hiding something. Miss Marple had learned long ago that few families are without secrets. This one, she thought, had too many. "Of course," Beatrice said suddenly, her voice tight. "None of you touched the teapot today." A pause fell over the table like a dropped curtain. Dr. Morley gave a small chuckle. "Come now, Beatrice. You're not really taken in by all that rot, are you?" Beatrice's fingers trembled as she lifted her wineglass. "It's not rot. It's a fact. That teapot is cursed. Mrs. Delaney used it once, died a fortnight later, and old Colonel Havisham fell down the stairs after his second cup." Charles Merton leaned in with relish. "It's 18th century porcelain, Mandarin pattern, possibly Qing dynasty. The legends surrounding it are, well, quite fascinating." Miss Marple sipped her soup thoughtfully. "Objects rarely carry malice, my dear. People, on the other hand." "Laugh all you like," Beatrice said, glaring around the table. "I've locked it away in the cabinet. It's not to be touched." No one replied. Miss Marple saw it then, that flicker in Nigel's eyes. Not fear, annoyance, as if something he'd planned had just gone slightly awry. Superstition may cloud the judgment of many, but for Miss Marple, it always served as a smokescreen for something far more human. The next morning broke grey and damp, a thin mist curling along the hedgerows. Miss Marple was awakened not by the maid's knock, but by raised voices and hurried footsteps outside her door. She rose, dressed quickly, and stepped into the hallway just as Clara Langford rushed past, weeping into a handkerchief. Martha, the housemaid, stood pale and breathless at the top of the stairs. "It's Mrs. Langford," she said. She's gone, ma'am." Miss Marple entered the bedroom softly. Beatrice lay in bed, her eyes closed, her face calm, as though she had simply drifted off in the middle of a peaceful dream. The doctor had been summoned. Nigel stood in the corner, arms folded tightly. No one spoke. But what drew Miss Marple's attention was not the body. It was the object on the nightstand, the teapot, the very one Beatrice had forbidden anyone to touch. Its porcelain surface gleamed faintly in the morning light, and though untouched, it radiated quiet menace. "How did this get here?" Miss Marple asked softly. No one answered, and in that silence, the mystery was born. Not of a death alone, but of how fear, superstition, and something far colder had crept into the room during the night. The official explanation, delivered with confident ease by Dr. Morley, was that Beatrice Langford had died of heart failure in her sleep. A peaceful passing, really, and not altogether unexpected in someone with her history. Miss Marple listened, as always, with polite attentiveness. She even nodded once or twice, murmuring her sympathy to the others. But in the back of her mind, a quiet disquiet stirred. Beatrice had not seemed like a woman near death. Pale, yes. Troubled, certainly. but not fading. There had been a sharpness to her the previous evening, a nervous energy that had burned bright beneath her words, not the weary resignation of one expecting to die. More unsettling was the presence of the teapot. Dr. Morley had made no mention of it, nor had the others, yet there it sat, deliberately placed, unmissable. Miss Marple recalled Beatrice's declaration over supper. "It's locked away. No one is to touch it. So why had it appeared without explanation on her nightstand?" Martha, the maid, had claimed no knowledge of how it got there. Clara had shaken her head. Nigel had shrugged, saying perhaps Beatrice had changed her mind. But there had been no key found in her room, and the cabinet in which the teapot had been stored remained locked. No forced entry, no sign of struggle. A convenient death. Too convenient, Miss Marple thought. And she had learned over long years and countless cups of tea that convenience was rarely innocent. It was announced that very afternoon that the estate would pass in its entirety to Mr. Nigel Langford. The solicitor had been expected, the paperwork was already in motion, and Nigel himself seemed neither surprised nor particularly mournful. He accepted condolences with well-rehearsed solemnity, clasping hands and muttering his thanks in the tone of one performing a necessary social rite. But Miss Marple, seated nearby with her embroidery, noted the stiffness in his jaw, the quick glances he cast toward the drawing-room door whenever someone entered. He had not cried. Clara had. Even Charles Merton, who had barely known Beatrice, had looked unsettled. But Nigel was composed. Too composed. When Miss Marple offered a gentle word, "It must all feel very sudden, Mr. Langford." He offered her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Shocking, yes. But Aunt Beatrice had been unwell for years, you know." "I hadn't known," Miss Marple replied mildly. "She wrote to me only last week, full of spirit." That made him falter, just for a breath. His eyes shifted briefly before he recovered. Yes, well, she had her good days. Miss Marple nodded, returning to her stitches, but her mind turned again to the letter and to the word Beatrice had chosen. Danger, not illness, not frailty. Danger. And Miss Marple knew that few dangers came from failing hearts. Most came from other people. Clara Langford was a woman one might overlook. Pale, thin, and soft-spoken, she drifted through the house like a figure in a fading portrait. She spoke little, often wringing her hands or clasping them tightly in her lap, as though trying to hold something together within herself. Miss Marple encountered her later that day, in the conservatory, where Clara sat alone beside the drooping geraniums. She looked up with a start when Miss Marple entered, as though expecting someone else. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, not at all," Clara murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I always find gardens quite soothing," Miss Marple went on, settling herself nearby. "So much life, and so many secrets, if you know where to look." Clara said nothing. After a pause, Miss Marple added, "Beatrice spoke very highly of you in her letter. She said you were the only one she could trust." Clara's eyes filled instantly with tears, though none fell. I didn't do anything." "No, I expect not," Miss Marple replied softly. There was a silence then, fraught, delicate. "She was frightened," Clara said suddenly. "She told me she thought someone meant to harm her." Miss Marple reached across and gently patted her hand. "And were you frightened too?" Clara did not answer, but the way she lowered her head, the slight tremor in her shoulders, told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. Fear, she thought, was a shadow that often pointed to the light behind it. Someone, indeed, had something to hide. Miss Marple found Dr. Felix Morley later that afternoon, in the drawing room leafing absent-mindedly through a botanical journal. He greeted her with his usual cheer, well practiced, she thought, and a little too brisk. "Miss Marple," he said, standing as she entered. "I do hope you're bearing up. A sudden loss always takes one aback." "Indeed," she replied. "Though I must confess, Doctor, suddenness is exactly what puzzles me." He tilted his head. "Oh?" "Beatrice seemed perfectly lucid and animated last evening. Quite determined, in fact." "Well, heart conditions can be deceptive," he said quickly. "Many patients show energy in their final hours. A cruel trick of the body, really." Miss Marple nodded, but her eyes held his steadily. "I imagine you prescribed something for her heart." "Digitalis," he replied. "Mild dosage, quite routine." "And she was still taking it regularly?" The doctor hesitated only slightly. "Yes, as far as I'm aware." "I suppose you keep track of her prescriptions?" "Well, She handled most of it herself. Independent sort of woman, your friend." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, yes, most independent, especially about things that frightened her." His expression changed for just a fraction of a second. Then the smile returned. "You mustn't let her fears worry you, Miss Marple. Old houses and old tales. People see ghosts where none exist." She did not contradict him, but she noted how quickly he changed the subject, and how neatly he avoided mentioning who else might have had access to Beatrice's medicine. Martha Pike had served the Langfords for over 2 decades. A plain woman of sturdy build, she was not easily spooked. Yet in the days since Beatrice's death, her eyes darted at shadows, and she jumped at sudden noises. Miss Marple found her in the linen room, folding sheets with mechanical care. "Martha, my dear," she said gently, "you look as though you've not slept a wink." Martha hesitated, then gave a shaky laugh. "I suppose I haven't, ma'am." "Something troubling you?" After a long pause, Martha glanced toward the open door, then lowered her voice. "I heard someone that night, walking in the corridor, just after midnight." "Not Mrs. Langford herself?" "No, ma'am. She never left her room at night. I used to bring her tea in the morning. Always found her curtains still drawn." "Did you see who it was?" Martha's hands fumbled with the sheets. "Number. Just the sound. Soft steps. Not heavy like a man's. But not quite light either." Miss Marple waited. "But I'm not saying more," Martha said firmly. "Things have been strange in this house, ever since that teapot came back out." Miss Marple offered a kind smile. "You've nothing to fear from the truth, Martha. But I do understand that fear of people is often greater than fear of legends." The maid said nothing more, but Miss Marple noted the tremor in her voice, and how she glanced toward Clara Langford's room as she left. Charles Merton appeared later that evening, pipe in hand, roaming the study with a restless sort of energy. He seemed uninterested in the family's grief, but very interested in the display cabinet in which Beatrice had once stored the infamous teapot. Miss Marple, seated by the fire, addressed him lightly. "You seem drawn to that cabinet, Mr. Merton." He chuckled. "Habit. I'm an antiquarian by nature. Bit of a disease, I suppose." "And what do you make of the teapot?" His brow furrowed slightly. "It's a fascinating piece. Mandarin pattern. Late Qing. Quite valuable. But of course its worth is rather tainted by the nonsense surrounding it." "Do you believe it's cursed?" "Not in the supernatural sense, no," he said quickly. "But I do believe in stories. And some stories, well, they're dangerous in their own way." "I was told you offered to purchase it from Beatrice." He shrugged. "A modest offer. She refused, naturally. Said it belonged in the house, family heirloom, sentiment, and so forth." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And yet you continued to ask." He grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been known to be persistent." Miss Marple noted the gleam in his gaze, not of superstition, but of something colder. Acquisition. He may not have believed in curses, but he certainly believed in value. And she had long learned that people killed for value far more often than for ghosts. Miss Marple, though she said little of import aloud, had been taking quiet inventory of the house since her arrival. Not of furniture or antiques, but of behavior, shifts in tone, hesitations in speech, things not said that ought to have been. She spoke with Clara again that evening, noting how the young woman flinched at raised voices. Nigel, by contrast, kept himself busy with letters and legal matters, showing what seemed a little to too much enthusiasm in consulting the family solicitor. Dr. Morley avoided prolonged conversation. Charles hovered near the cabinet and was seen inspecting its lock, and Martha moved silently through the corridors, wary as a cat in a house of dogs. It was, in truth, exactly the sort of household that Miss Marple had encountered many times before. One where tension lived just beneath the surface, varnished over by politeness. She asked casual questions. When Beatrice had last changed her will, whether Clara and Nigel had ever hosted guests, how often the doctor visited. The answers she received were bland, but the ways they were delivered told her more. Nigel stammered over the will. Clara looked to her husband before speaking. Dr. Morley gave vague timings that did not quite match with Martha's account. No one lied outright. But truth, Miss Marple had learned, is often most visible not by what is said, but by who looks away when it is. And slowly, like a tapestry coming into view through candlelight, she began to see it. It was well past tea time when Miss Marple entered the drawing room, ostensibly in search of her forgotten knitting basket. The fire crackled cheerfully, throwing golden light across the room, and across Nigel Langford, who knelt by the hearth feeding something into the flames. He started when he saw her. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone overly bright. "Just clearing out some old clutter. Aunt Beatrice kept everything, bless her." Miss Marple smiled. "Paperwork does have a way of accumulating. What were they, if I may ask?" "Oh, nothing of significance. Old bills, outdated insurance forms. No need for them now." He gestured toward a stack of yellowing envelopes on the floor beside him, though Miss Marple noted they were already partially singed. He moved to toss the last of them into the grate, but she spoke before he could. "I do hope there's nothing official among them," she said lightly. The vicar once burned a perfectly good lease by mistake, and it caused no end of trouble with the parish committee. Nigel laughed a little too quickly. "Oh, no fear of that. I've checked them all." Miss Marple watched the curling edges of the paper turn to ash. It was not the bills that interested her, but the speed with which he had acted, as though certain documents were better gone before anyone had the time, or inclination, to read them. Miss Marple wandered into the study the next morning and was mildly surprised to find Charles Merton hunched over the glass-fronted cabinet where Beatrice had kept the teapot. His back was to her, and though he straightened quickly at the sound of her entrance, she did not miss the guilty flicker in his eyes. "Mr. Merton," she said pleasantly, "I do hope I'm not intruding." He cleared his throat. "Not at all, Miss Marple. I was just admiring the collection. Indeed, a fascinating one, by all accounts. I gather Mrs. Langford was quite the connoisseur of Oriental porcelain." Charles relaxed slightly, adopting a scholarly air. "Oh, yes. Some of these pieces are rather rare, though not all are authentic. That teapot, though, quite unique. I understand you once expressed an interest in acquiring it." He offered a sheepish smile. "Guilty as charged. I'm always on the lookout for curiosities with an unusual history." Miss Marple moved closer, noting a thin scratch near the lock. "And yet it remained locked. Even now?" "Well, yes, though I dare say someone had access to it more recently." His voice trailed off. He turned, busying himself with a dusty volume on the shelf. Miss Marple said nothing more, but her eyes lingered on the lock, slightly ajar. It was clear someone had opened it. Possibly him. Possibly someone else. But whoever it was, they had done so in secret. And secrets, in her experience, rarely stayed hidden for long. Later that day, Miss Marple encountered Dr. Morley on the front steps, about to depart in his motor car. He seemed distracted, his gaze shifting toward the driveway, more than toward her. "Doctor," she said gently, "might I trouble you for a moment? Just a small matter." He hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple, though I do have patients to attend. Just a quick query. I wondered if you happened to note the precise time of Beatrice's passing." He frowned. "Roughly. Between midnight and 1, I would say. Her body was cool when I arrived, but not cold." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And she had taken her medication that evening." "I assume so. You assume." He hesitated. "I wasn't in the habit of supervising her routine. She was quite independent, as you know. Quite. Though she seemed very particular about some things. I recall her insisting, even at supper, that the teapot be kept locked away." He flinched, barely but noticeably. Miss Marple continued, "And yet it appeared in her room that very night. Curious." "Yes, well, some things defy logic," he muttered. "Stress can lead to confusion." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "Or clarity, depending on who's observing." She let him go, watching as his car vanished down the lane. His responses had been vague, his timekeeping imprecise. And to Miss Marple's seasoned ear, nothing gave away guilt quite like the urge to hurry a conversation along before the questions had truly begun. It was Clara who found the note. She brought it to Miss Marple in a trembling hand, the folded paper still slightly crumpled from where it had been tucked behind a lavender sachet in Beatrice's writing desk. I thought you ought to see it," she whispered. "It seems important." The paper was old, the ink faint but legible, the handwriting undeniably Beatrice's. "If anything should happen to me, I want it known that Charles Merton has been pressing me to sell the teapot. I no longer trust his intentions. He wants it too badly." Miss Marple read it twice, then once more with narrowed eyes. "Curious," she murmured, "and found in such a timely fashion." Clara blinked. "You don't think she meant it?" "Oh, I believe she may have written it. But why hide it in a drawer she rarely used? And why now, when poor Beatrice had gone to such lengths to keep the teapot locked away?" Clara said nothing. Miss Marple gently refolded the note. "This feels too convenient. It points too directly. And in murder, as in life, truth rarely walks in a straight line." She remembered long ago a case in St. Mary Mead, where a will had been forged and planted precisely where it could be found by the right person at the right time. The guilty always hoped their lies would be mistaken for overlooked truths. This note, she thought, had been waiting to be found, and someone had made sure it would be. Miss Marple found Martha Pike again in the scullery, where the maid was peeling potatoes with more force than necessary. Her face was pinched and pale, and she barely looked up when addressed. "I thought I might ask you again," Miss Marple said, her tone light but firm. "About what you heard the night Mrs. Langford died." Martha hesitated. "I already told you. I heard someone. Footsteps in the corridor. Yes, but not who. She stopped peeling. The silence stretched. Finally, in a whisper, Martha said, "I saw a figure. Just a glimpse, by the corner where the corridor turns. It was a woman." "Are you certain?" "Aye, slender, hair tied back. Couldn't see the face. But it wasn't Mr. Nigel nor Dr. Morley. Too slight." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you tell anyone?" Martha's hands resumed their work. "No, ma'am. Didn't see the point. Everyone's whispering already. About Clara." "About Clara?" "She was nearest to Mrs. Langford's room, wasn't she? And she'd been looking right ill the past week." Miss Marple said nothing, but later, in the drawing room, she watched Clara pour tea with shaking hands, while Nigel looked on with a grim set to his jaw. It was easy to suspect the frightened, Miss Marple thought. Easier still to suspect the silent. But silence could come from fear, or from guilt, and not all who wandered hallways at night did so with murderous intent. It was Charles Merton himself who, rather unintentionally, drew Miss Marple's attention back to the teapot. He had insisted on examining it again in the presence of Clara and Dr. Morley, launching into an animated description of the porcelain's heritage, until he stopped mid-sentence. "There," he said, frowning, pointing with his pen. "That crack wasn't there before." A fine hairline fracture ran along the underside of the spout, barely noticeable to the untrained eye. "Curious," he muttered. "Absolutely wasn't visible the last time I saw it." Miss Marple leaned in. "You're quite sure?" "Positive. I examined it closely when I offered to buy it." Miss Marple's mind was already moving. The spout. The perfect place for something to pass unnoticed, if one wanted to deliver a liquid or mask a taste. Perhaps not the source of the poison itself, but a vessel for it. A delivery method. She turned to Dr. Morley. "Would digitalis have a taste, do you think?" He hesitated. "Not much, if diluted." "And if one were expecting tea with their medicine?" The doctor offered no answer. Miss Marple said nothing more, but her thoughts were now far from fractures and far more focused on timing, on spoons, cups, and the unspoken rituals of nightly tea. That evening, as she sat quietly knitting by the fire, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the war years, a time of scarcity, suspicion, and on occasion surprising ingenuity. She remembered a case, hushed but not forgotten, in which a widow in Tunbridge Wells had fallen ill under similar mysterious circumstances. Her tea had been poisoned, not through the pot, but through the sugar bowl. Her niece had dosed a single lump with strychnine, knowing the old woman would take 2. No one had thought to test the sugar. It had been a vicar's wife of all people who solved the mystery, a woman who knew, as Miss Marple did, that evil often hides in the ordinary. Now, her mind returned to Beatrice. The cursed teapot had drawn everyone's focus. But what if that was intentional? She considered the chipped guest teaspoon, the one missing from the set. Beatrice had been a creature of habit. Tea at night, medicine before bed. A single spoon could deliver the dose. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The curse, the legend, the fear. It had all been theatre, a distraction, just like the sugar bowl. She glanced at the fire, where ashes from Nigel's burn pile had long since gone cold. The truth was beginning to take shape. Not dramatic, not supernatural, but chilling in its simplicity. And as ever, it came down not to myth or porcelain, but to motive, opportunity, and human weakness. It was during a quiet moment in the morning room that Miss Marple noticed it. A faint yellowing bruise just beneath the edge of Clara's sleeve. The younger woman had been arranging lilies in a vase, her eyes downcast, her shoulders tense with the weight of unspoken thought. Miss Marple, ever so gently, asked, "Clara, dear, might I trouble you for a little help with the garden plans later? I find the roses at Elderflower have a rather untamed spirit." Clara smiled faintly, brushing her sleeve down with unnecessary care. "Of course, Miss Marple." But the movement had drawn attention to itself, and Miss Marple, who had long ago learned the language of fear, said nothing more until they sat in the rose garden that afternoon, ostensibly discussing bulbs and compost. "There are many kinds of silences," Miss Marple said conversationally. "The kind born of modesty, the kind born of sorrow, and the kind born of fear. The last is usually accompanied by bruises." Clara's hand tightened around her teacup. "Sometimes," Miss Marple continued, "people we trust use love as a leash. They convince us to keep their secrets, even when those secrets hurt." Clara's shoulders slumped. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper. "I didn't know what else to do." And Miss Marple knew then, with quiet certainty, that Clara had not only witnessed something, she had been made part of it. Clara's confession came slowly, as though dragging something from deep waters. "It was Nigel," she said, barely above a breath. "He asked me, no, told me, to put the teapot in Beatrice's room that night." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Go on, my dear." "He said it would frighten her, that she needed a little humbling, that all her talk of curses and suspicions was making people think she was losing her mind." "And you believed him?" I didn't know what to believe. He made it sound like a joke, but not really. He was angry. He'd argued with her earlier that day, about the will." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "The will? She changed it," Clara whispered. "I don't know the details, but I think she planned to leave something to me. Nigel found out. He was livid." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "So he used the one thing Beatrice feared most to push her over the edge." Clara nodded. "He told me to take the teapot from the cabinet after she went to bed. Said he'd make sure the key was available. I didn't want to, but..." She held out her wrist slightly, and the bruise Miss Marple had seen came into the light. "I was afraid," she said simply. "He told me no one would believe me if I said anything, that it would only make things worse." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "You mustn't blame yourself. Being frightened does not make one guilty, but it does make one vulnerable." She reached out and touched Clara's hand. "The truth," she said, "has a way of finding its path, even when others would rather it didn't." Later that day, Miss Marple wandered into the kitchen under the pretense of searching for some lavender to ease a headache. Martha Pike was in the garden, and the room was quiet save for the ticking of the old brass clock near the pantry. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the cutlery drawer. With the lightest of movements, she opened it and examined the row of teaspoons. Silver-plated, each identical, except for one. One had a chip on the handle. She remembered it from her first tea at Elderflower Lodge, a guest spoon, set apart by its slight imperfection. Lifting it gently, she turned it in the light. There, just near the bowl of the spoon, a faint trace of something pale and granular clung to the edge. Most wouldn't have noticed. Miss Marple, however, knew better than to overlook residue. She wrapped it in a clean handkerchief and returned to the sitting room, where Clara sat reading absently. "Clara," she said softly, "which spoon did you use the night you brought your aunt her tea?" Clara looked up, startled. "The one on the tray already." Nigel had laid it out. Of course he had. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "And you wouldn't have noticed whether it matched the others, would you?" Clara shook her head. Miss Marple placed the wrapped spoon into her handbag and sat back in her chair. The final piece was falling into place, a spoon set out not for hospitality, but for harm. A chipped relic of the tea service, used to deliver death under the guise of routine. A cursed teapot, indeed. But the curse, Miss Marple now understood, was not in the porcelain. It had always been in the hand that held the cup. Miss Marple spent the evening alone in her room, her thoughts moving in calm but precise patterns. She had not spoken a word of the chipped spoon to anyone but Clara, yet her conclusion had already begun to crystallize. The doctor's certificate had named heart failure, a reasonable assessment given Beatrice's known condition. But in Miss Marple's experience, reasonable assessments were often the most useful of disguises. What disturbed her most was not what was listed, but what was assumed. Digitalis, a medicine for the heart, derived from foxglove, effective in small doses, and fatal in larger ones. A compound that would leave no scent, no taste, and few traces if administered cleverly. Beatrice had taken her medication religiously, and yet she had died peacefully in her sleep, just after being forced to face the one object in the house that terrified her most, the teapot. Miss Marple now understood it had never been about the teapot. It was a ruse, a theatrical distraction, a red herring steeped in superstition. By making Beatrice believe the curse had come for her, the murderer ensured she would cling to her evening ritual, a cup of tea, a sip of comfort, a familiar medicine. The poison had not come from within the pot, but from without. It had been slipped into the teaspoon, perhaps even the cup, just enough to silence a heart already weakened by age and fear. And while the household whispered of ancient legends and porcelain curses, the true danger had passed unnoticed, cleverly hidden in plain sight, behind an object no one dared question. Miss Marple had long observed that superstition, when properly harnessed, could be far more effective than any weapon. And in Elderflower Lodge, that power had been used with chilling precision. Beatrice Langford was not a foolish woman, but she had grown increasingly anxious in recent years. The teapot had been part of her family's legacy. Yes, but it had also been whispered about, blamed for mishaps, strokes of ill luck, even death. And such whispers, repeated over time, wove themselves into belief. Nigel Langford had known that. He had witnessed her jump at shadows, her hands tremble when the subject was raised. He had heard her express a desire to lock it away and leave it forgotten. And so, he had done the opposite. He had made certain the teapot would return, placed not by his own hand, but by Clara's, under coercion and threat. Beatrice had found it on her bedside table. In that moment, all her fears had been confirmed. The curse had come. Terrified, she had done what she always did, poured herself a calming cup of tea, taken her nightly dose of digitalis, and lain down to wait for sleep to take her. She never woke again. It was not the object that killed her, but the belief in it. Nigel had weaponized her imagination, her deepest dread, and used it to cloud all suspicion. It had been, Miss Marple thought grimly, almost elegant in its cruelty. The final puzzle came together with the quiet arrival of Mr. Hesketh, the family solicitor, who had been summoned earlier at Miss Marple's suggestion, under the pretense of assisting with the estate. In the privacy of the library, over a modest tray of tea and lemon biscuits, Miss Marple gently asked whether Mrs. Langford had made any recent changes to her will. Hesketh blinked behind his spectacles. As a matter of fact, yes. A week ago, I visited her here to witness the revision. She wanted to leave a modest trust to Mrs. Clara Langford, independent of her husband. Miss Marple nodded. And was Mr. Nigel Langford, aware of this? Well, he wasn't present during our meeting, but it wouldn't have been difficult for him to guess. He's always been rather interested in financial matters. She thanked him politely and left him to his biscuits. Later that afternoon, as she sat knitting in the morning room, her mind settled over the facts, like a shawl pulled tight on a chilly day. Nigel had motive, fear of losing inheritance, of being displaced in his aunt's affections and her estate. He had opportunity. He lived in the house, controlled the household, and set the tea tray. And he had method, digitalis, easily acquired and untraceable in a dose masked by routine. And now, Miss Marple knew, he had something else as well, a deadline. The new will was not yet filed with the registry. Had Beatrice died a few days later, Clara might have inherited. But dying when she did, the estate defaulted back to Nigel in its entirety. It was not haste born of grief. It was haste born of necessity, a race against time, and the law. And in that knowledge, the crime lost its mystery, revealing its truest face, cold, selfish, and entirely human. It was just after supper when Miss Marple made her request, polite but firm, that everyone in the household convene in the drawing room. The hour was not dramatic, nor the weather stormy. Instead, the house lay under the soft hush of twilight, as if it too were waiting to exhale. Nigel arrived first, smoothing his jacket with mechanical precision. Clara entered next, visibly pale but composed. Dr. Morley followed, looking vaguely irritated, and Charles Merton wandered in behind them, pipe in hand, though unlit. Martha lingered by the door, uncertain whether she should remain. "You're most welcome, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, indicating an empty chair for the maid. There was a brief silence as the guests settled themselves, each with varying degrees of wariness. Miss Marple remained standing by the fireplace, hands folded neatly, her expression as serene as ever. "Thank you for coming," she began. "It is not my custom to intrude upon family affairs, but in this instance I believe we all seek clarity, and perhaps justice." Nigel raised a brow. "Is this quite necessary, Miss Marple?" "I believe it is," she replied. "There has been a death, a woman frightened, then silenced, and we have allowed ourselves to attribute her end to myth, when the truth is much more deliberate." No one spoke. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Let us speak plainly. We are not dealing with a curse. We are dealing with murder." "The story of the cursed teapot," Miss Marple continued, "has captured this house's imagination for some time. I've heard mention of accidents, misfortune, even death, blamed upon an object made of porcelain and ink." Charles gave a small snort. "Well, it has an unfortunate history." "Indeed," she said mildly. "And yet porcelain does not kill. People do." There was a subtle shift in the room. Clara stared into her lap. Nigel, for the first time, seemed to stiffen. Mrs. Langford feared the teapot, but more than that, she feared the idea of it. She had come to associate it with something malignant, something that might strike her down. That fear made her vulnerable. Miss Marple paced slowly, not in performance but in careful thought. Someone understood that vulnerability and used it to their advantage. The teapot was removed from the locked cabinet and placed at her bedside, by a trembling hand, not its own. That act alone was enough to unnerve her, to convince her that the inevitable had come. Martha gasped softly. Nigel shifted in his seat. "And yet," Miss Marple went on, "Mrs. Langford did not die from fright. Her heart did not simply fail. It was made to fail, with the assistance of something far less theatrical and far more precise." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The teapot was a mask, a legend weaponized. But behind that legend was a mind, cold, deliberate, and calculating, and it is that mind we must now unmask. There was, you see, Miss Marple said evenly, another element in play the night Mrs. Langford died. Something not cursed, not supernatural, but entirely chemical. She withdrew a folded handkerchief from her handbag and unwrapped it to reveal the chipped silver teaspoon. This was the spoon placed on her tea tray that evening, chipped, mismatched, and coated with faint traces of digitalis. Dr. Morley stood. That's absurd. It would be impossible to tell that with the naked eye. I imagine a proper laboratory would confirm it, Miss Marple replied. But the taste alone, if subtle, might not have been noticed by Mrs. Langford, especially if she believed she was under the influence of something much worse. Charles looked uncomfortable. Digitalis from her prescription? Precisely. Miss Marple nodded. In small doses, a medicine. In larger ones, poison. She turned to Nigel, whose expression was unreadable. Someone had access to both her medication and her routine. Someone who knew she would take her tea and pills without hesitation, especially when frightened. That someone made certain the teapot appeared, that her usual routine continued, and that just enough digitalis would see her to a quiet, undisturbed death. Silence fell. Clara sat motionless, her knuckles white. Nigel broke it with a short, incredulous laugh. Are we now accusing ghosts of poisoning tea? No, Miss Marple said quietly. We are accusing someone who believed fear was as useful as a dagger, and less likely to leave a mark. Miss Marple's voice was steady, her hands folded in her lap as she addressed the gathered group. The pieces of the puzzle had all fallen into place. You see, she said softly, what makes this crime so insidious is how well it was planned. Every detail, carefully orchestrated. A perfect scheme, if you will. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. Nigel Langford had the means. He lived in this house. He knew Beatrice's routine, her fears, and her weaknesses. He had access to her room, her medicine, and the teapot that was part of the household ritual. But more than that, Miss Marple added, he had the motive. The inheritance, the will, the fear of losing his position and wealth, all of it converged in his mind. He knew Beatrice had altered her will, intending to leave Clara something substantial. That change would have meant his fortune was at risk. Nigel shifted in his seat, his eyes avoiding Miss Marple's direct gaze. And then, she went on, there was the opportunity. Beatrice's deep-seated superstition was the perfect cover for his plan. He used her fear of the curse to manipulate her into doing exactly what he needed, taking her medication while believing she was under threat from something beyond her control. Her eyes flicked around the room, noting the discomfort in Nigel's posture. She knew he was trapped now, unable to avoid the truth. The teapot, Miss Marple concluded, was never the instrument of death. It was merely the distraction. The real weapon was the poison, delivered through her nightly routine, masked by a simple cup of tea. Miss Marple turned her gaze to Clara, who was seated with her hands folded tightly in her lap. And Clara, my dear, Miss Marple continued gently, I know you have suffered under the weight of someone else's fear. Clara's face was pale, her eyes filled with quiet guilt. I didn't want to do it, Miss Marple, she whispered. I was so frightened of Nigel. He said I had no choice, that no one would believe me if I told them what he was planning. Miss Marple nodded kindly. You were coerced, Clara. I saw the bruise on your wrist. a mark of force, not of will. Clara flinched slightly at the reminder. He made me do it. He said it was just a prank, that I should place the teapot in Aunt Beatrice's room to scare her, but nothing more. Miss Marple's eyes softened as she addressed Clara's unspoken fears. He used your love for Beatrice, your loyalty to him, to make you complicit, and he manipulated your fear of his anger to ensure you would comply. But you, Clara, were not part of the crime. You were a victim of it. The room was silent for a moment, as Clara's relief began to slowly spread across her face. She hadn't wanted to harm anyone. She had only been following orders, believing there was no other choice. Miss Marple gave her a small, reassuring smile. Fear can be a powerful thing, but it is not always the truth. It was the small, seemingly insignificant detail that finally caught Nigel in his own web of deceit. Miss Marple had kept the spoon in her pocket all through the earlier confrontation, but now she placed it gently on the table before them all. It gleamed dully in the light, a guest spoon, chipped along its handle, a piece of silverware that had been taken from the tea tray the night of Beatrice's death. It was the spoon, Miss Marple explained. This particular spoon was the one used to stir Beatrice's tea, and it had a small but crucial imperfection, one that was absent the last time I observed the tea set. She paused, noting the growing tension in the room. It wasn't just a mistake that caused the crack in the handle, Miss Marple went on. It was a deliberate misstep. Someone had used this spoon to deliver the fatal dose, but they failed to clean it thoroughly. Nigel's face went pale as the realization dawned. He had used the spoon, thinking no one would ever notice its small flaw, its imperfection. He had assumed that it would blend in with the other silverware, unnoticed by everyone, even Beatrice herself. But he had underestimated Miss Marple. The tiniest of details, the smallest of mistakes, was all it took to unravel the truth. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her hands folded, as the weight of the mystery finally settled into clarity. "The curse," she said softly, her voice calm and measured, "was never real. It was the perfect illusion, a legend born of superstition and fear, weaponized by the murderer to keep suspicion at bay." She looked around the room, her eyes meeting each person in turn. Nigel used the superstition surrounding the teapot to cloud everyone's judgment. He made his aunt believe that the teapot's curse was the source of her death, and in doing so, he concealed his true motive. Clara looked at Miss Marple, her face a mixture of confusion and relief. But what about the teapot? Why was it left in her room if it wasn't part of the plan? "It was a distraction," Miss Marple replied. "A red herring. The real weapon was far simpler and more deadly. Digitalis, a poison no one would think to look for, hidden in plain sight within her routine." Miss Marple paused for a moment, allowing the silence to envelop them all. "Greed," she said quietly, "is often the truest curse of all. And it was greed that drove Nigel to murder. He feared losing his inheritance, his position, and when the will changed in Clara's favor, he knew he had to act quickly. So he used the one thing that would guarantee his success, the belief in the curse." Nigel's face was ashen now, his defiance crumbling under the weight of Miss Marple's calm, unshakable logic. "The curse was never in the teapot," Miss Marple concluded. "It was in his heart." The moment had arrived. Nigel Langford was arrested, his hands bound by the cold iron of the law. The constable who had entered quietly moments earlier now escorted him from the room, his gait slow but resolute. Nigel, for all his outward composure, sneered at the irony of it all. "A chipped spoon," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, his words laced with a mixture of disdain and disbelief. "This is how it ends, then? A teaspoon?" He gave Miss Marple one final glance, his eyes narrowed, as if daring her to acknowledge the absurdity of the situation. "You truly think a spoon proved my guilt? That is your evidence?" Miss Marple, her expression calm and unruffled, merely replied, "It wasn't the spoon, Mr. Langford. It was your own actions that sealed your fate. The spoon was only the final, telling detail." As the constables led him toward the door, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest of sighs. Relief, mingled with a sense of quiet triumph. The game was up, and the truth, at long last, had been revealed. As the door closed behind the constables, Clara Langford's composure shattered. She had remained stoic throughout the ordeal, but now her body trembled with the force of her relief. Her hands, which had remained tightly clasped, flew to her face as her sobs began, soft at first, then overwhelming. Miss Marple moved quickly to her side, offering her steadying presence. She gently guided Clara to the settee, where she collapsed, burying her face in her hands. "You need not fear any more, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, her voice full of compassion. "It is over. The truth has come to light." Clara's voice was barely audible through her tears. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just didn't know how to stop him." "I understand," Miss Marple reassured her. "You were afraid. But no one will blame you now. You were a victim of his manipulation." Clara's tears slowly subsided as she looked up, her eyes filled with gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I don't know what would have happened without you." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "You did the hardest part yourself. The rest was simply a matter of connecting the dots." Clara nodded, and for the first time she allowed herself to exhale fully, as if a great weight had been lifted from her heart. A week passed before Miss Marple's involvement in the case came to its final resolution. The Teapot, which had once inspired so much fear and superstition, was carefully packed and placed in the hands of the local museum curator. The legends surrounding it, once so terrifying to the Langford family, would now be relegated to the pages of history books, a mere curiosity in the eyes of future visitors. The curator, Mr. Avery, examined the teapot with a professional detachment that Miss Marple found almost amusing. "A most fascinating object," he said, turning it over in his hands. "A true relic of a bygone era." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes softening. "It has lost its power now," she said. "There are no longer any ghosts to haunt it. The only thing left is the story." The teapot was placed on a shelf, surrounded by other objects of historical interest. But to Miss Marple's mind, its importance had already shifted, from a dangerous artifact to a simple symbol of human greed and manipulation. Its curse had been broken, and its legend now lived only in the minds of those who remembered. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat at her usual spot by the window, a fresh pot of tea brewing on the table. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Hartley, had come over for their regular catch-up, and they sat in comfortable silence, enjoying the warmth of the room and the scent of the tea. "You've had quite the experience, Miss Marple," Mrs. Hartley remarked, her tone sympathetic. "But tell me, what do you think was behind it all? The teapot? The curse? Was it superstition, after all?" Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes thoughtful. "Superstition can be a powerful thing, my dear, but it is rarely the root of evil. Greed, fear, and pride. They are the true culprits." She sipped her tea and added, "It's never the object, you see. It's always the person behind it." Mrs. Hartley nodded, as if understanding something deeper than words could express. "Yes, Miss Marple, you're right." They sat in silence again, the soft ticking of the clock, their only companion. Miss Marple's voice was quiet but firm as she reflected on the case. "You see, my dear, the real curse wasn't in the teapot or the superstition. It was in the heart of the man who used it, and that is always the most dangerous curse of all. As the dust settles and the mystery is laid to rest, we are reminded that sometimes the most dangerous forces in life are not curses or superstitions, but the darkness within the human heart. In this case, a simple teaspoon, a long-held fear, and a carefully constructed ruse became the instruments of betrayal, driven by greed and fear of losing power. And yet, through it all, it was Miss Marple's calm, logical mind that unraveled the truth. The real curse wasn't in the porcelain teapot, but in the choices made by those who sought to manipulate and control. As we watch the teapot find its final resting place in the museum, its legend shattered and its power broken, we are left with a lesson. True power lies not in objects, but in the people who wield them. But here's the question. What if you had been in Clara's shoes? Would you have acted differently, or would fear have led you down the same path? Could you have stood up against Nigel's coercion, or would you have been too afraid to challenge him? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Did you see the twist coming? Or did Miss Marple's methodical investigation surprise you? Let us know in the comments below. What would you have done if you were Clara, caught between fear and loyalty? And don't forget, if you enjoyed this story and want more thrilling mysteries like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Share this with your friends and family who love a good puzzle and a sharp mind like Miss Marple's. Thank you for watching, and we can't wait to see you again for our next story.